Well, hello and welcome to Risk Management, EMG 6301. I am your professor. I'm Dr. David Mylan, and I'll be here for the semester for you. I hope that you find the course enjoyable throughout the term over the next 8 weeks, and we do have 3 collaborative sessions that we will be looking at. This is session 1. Session 2 will be in another couple weeks, probably around week 4, and then we'll have the final one during week 7. So altogether it'll be 3. These are not required. These are optional, but we're here just to reach out to our students to make sure that they have an opportunity to listen in and being able to identify a little bit more with the courses that we have, the topics that we are going to cover, and just perhaps put a little bit more personable touch into our classroom here along the way. So this particular session here, we're going to be looking at units 1 through 3, and it'll cover a variety of areas, and most of it's going to be covered from the lectures that we have written for your study guide, but we'll just touch on some different things, and again, a little bit more live and in-person type of deal here for you to be able to look at this thing perhaps from a different perspective, a few different lenses, and then being able to perhaps focus in the discussion boards a little bit more and offer your comments and suggestions to your colleagues along the way. So without further ado, let's get started here. And what we're going to be looking at here in first is risk management. Well, you're thinking, well, what does risk management have to do with national emergencies and dealing with emergencies in general? Well, it has everything. There are risks that are involved with emergencies and emergency management, disasters, apocalypse that we've seen over in Japan in 2011, as well as a lot of other disasters that we've encountered here in the United States. But also keep in mind, too, that this is a national approach to homeland security and emergency management within the U.S. here, and also revolves around the 5 mission areas, which are prevention, protection, response, recovery, and mitigation. When we prevent something, we are taking a look at it with a broad perspective at first. What we're trying to do is trying to think of ways how we can prevent something, what is going to happen out there, and try and put our guard up. And that leads us into protection. How do we protect one another, and how do we protect certain areas, and especially if we're dealing with communities that may be flooded, how are we going to protect them from rivers flooding, perhaps seawalls that may break, or if levees break, etc. We've seen that in many hurricanes and many other disasters that pertain to flooding and natural emergencies, but we also have to consider that being able to protect our community begins with prevention. Then it's going to be the overall response that we have. We're going to respond to this how. Emergency managers have a lot of challenges out there on how to respond to an emergency or a disaster, and it's going to depend on the resources that they have. Emergency managers, much like what we've seen in the COVID-19 responses, they may not have enough ventilators for people. They may not have enough hospital beds or supplies that are going to be out there. It starts at the local level, then it works into the state, and then probably, as you all know, then it works up into the federal level to where there's going to be needed supplies, or perhaps that is going to be a federal disaster area that is going to be called in a given situation. So keep that in mind as you're working through that. The response is going to start from a local perspective and then move on up to the federal area. Then we have the recovery. That one sometimes isn't the most interesting of all things that is associated with a disaster, and that is going to be building it back. So you might have a recovery plan that might be initially for the immediate future. It might be 5 to 10 days, for example. And then you're going to have one that's probably going to be a couple weeks out. You might have another one that's going to be 30 days, another one 45 days, 60 days, 90 days. Hopefully you won't have to go anywhere beyond that. Just keep in mind that in an initial disaster response, that it's going to take approximately 96 hours for the federal government, or the state government for that matter, to be immobilized. And that's if everything is going very well. In planning a lot of these things, you need to identify some of the resources that you have within your own jurisdiction. You're going to have to work alongside other jurisdictions. Interjurisdictional resources are going to be necessary, and you're also going to need to communicate with them. And during this recovery phase, they all kind of blend together, and the reason why is because now we're recuperating everything that we've probably lost along the way, depending on the type of emergency or disaster that has taken taken place. And then finally, you have mitigation. In order to mitigate some of the circumstances that are surrounding us, we are going to have to do what? We're going to have to plan. We're going to have to prevent. We're going to have to protect. Those are the three P's there: plan, prevent, and protect. And that's going to be all tied up into mitigation. We have lessons learned from the community members as well as those that perhaps are community stakeholders, such as political stakeholders, for example. And with this, you have an opportunity to well, tap their brains, for lack of a better expression, in an effort to mitigate circumstances. If there was a flood approximately 30 years ago and many of the residents still remember that or still live within that jurisdiction that happened to be flooded, then you have an opportunity to understand what took place and some of the prevention measures that might need to be done in the future. So that comes into play. You may still have political stakeholders that are there. They may have worked their way up the ladder within the council, or if they happen to be the mayor now, then that's one or two areas that you have the benefit of tapping a resource, not only as a remembrance of what may have taken place, but also those presidential flashcards, better known as Grant, Benjamin, and Lincoln, that you all need when a disaster strikes and spending needs to occur. Yes, I mean money. I'll just be blunt. You will need money for this stuff. And that's where this National Mitigation Framework and the National Disaster Recovery Framework come into play. And that contains the national plans that are focused on the whole community, the collaboration and the coordination in the mitigation and the recovery efforts that are ongoing continually. So it all kind of ties in together. So you have a national approach for Homeland Security and emergency management here in the U.S. You're looking at the 5 main areas of prevention, protection, response, recovery, and mitigation. And then you also have the National Mitigation Framework, the National Disaster Recovery Framework, and then it all ties together nicely in coordination with mitigation and collaboration, as well as the recovery efforts that are going to be needed after a disaster has taken place. And moving on to our next slide here, planning for disasters requires a lot of consideration of the hazards that are going to be involved and the evaluation of the risks for consideration of mitigation. For example, if you happen to live in a highly industrialized area, such as my area is here near the city of Chicago, you're going to have a different approach to, for example, hazardous materials, how they're going to be transported, how hazardous materials are going to be needed for cleaning supplies is another example. Now we have to take a look at this with a different set of lenses because we have schools nearby. You really can't take hazardous materials in trucks that are going to be a flammable 3 and pass through a school area without proper placarding, without proper jurisdiction, without proper federal regulations, etc. So it's going to come into play where you need to take into account a lot of these risks, a lot of these situations, and a lot of these movements that are going to go on. Rail yards are another big area too that we need to consider. So planning for a disaster. Now, a disaster doesn't have to be a natural disaster. We have the human-made disaster that takes place. And a lot of these human-made disasters can be anything from a spark that can ignite something to obviously something that is going to be planned well ahead of time in advance, such as the Twin Towers in 2001. So we need to understand that a lot of this is going to depend upon the nature of the incident as well as being able to mitigate some of those circumstances. So being able to work alongside a coalition for emergency response has a lot of benefits. Coalition for Emergency Response. You're like, well, Dr. Milan, what is that? I mean, does everybody run out the door and just go to the emergency? No. We sit around the table, we talk about different thoughts, different ideas, get different opinions, and see what may take place. What are some of the major risks, some of the main categories that are within our communities, and then be able to decipher that information and then be able to sort it out. You have various training exercises. You may be able to do a tabletop exercise, or if budgets permit and time permits, you might be able to do a full-scale exercise. Community involvement is a key element in any type of emergency services management, as well as being able to plan for the type of disaster that may take place. Then determining that risk is often informed by the likelihood of that specific hazard that is going to occur. And I kind of touched on that a little bit here. That particular area, if it has hazardous materials, if it's going to be in a rail yard and there happens to be explosion there, then you have to realize what the potential impact of that explosion is going to be, what previous occurrences may have taken place, as well as a specific hazard that is going to cascade into other events. So just because there's an explosion, that is one event, but now if that chemical happens to go in the air and the community happens to be downwind from that chemical explosion that is producing a hazard, much like what we see many times in oil refineries as well as other chemicals that explode on highways, this does pose a hazard, and these are some of the circumstances and situations that need to be looked at. So planning for disasters require the consideration of the hazards, the evaluation of the risk hazards, and considering the type of mitigation that will eventually take place. You determine those hazards, then the informed likelihood of that specific hazard taking place in that designated location will then promote a potential hazard in that location or somewhere else if it happens to be, much as I mentioned here, a hazardous material that is emitted into the air. And then the previous occurrences. So what happened in the past? What's the history behind this incident or this rail yard? What might be needed here that we can learn from previous experiences? And these events eventually will cascade into something other than what is just mentioned here. It's going to be a series of events that if this hazard takes place in the rail yard, then it's going to impact the community. How's it going to impact the community? Then it's going to impact the hospitals because we may have patients that go there. This is what we mean as a cascading event, and these are how some of these specific hazards can make an impact upon the community and mitigation for risk management purposes. So now you're saying, Dr. Milan, is there anything that we can do out there in order to minimize some of these threats, in order to work alongside one another? I'm glad you asked me that question. I know you were there, and I knew you wanted to ask me that question. So what we're going to be looking at here is working together. We work alongside one another in an effort to minimize some of the issues that take place, in order to promote some of the strategies. One of the main things to do is to educate people and educate the public officials on the value of risk management and the hazards that are out there, some of the mitigation practices that are essential in order to protect the community. It takes time, effort, and that presidential flashcard that I was mentioning, money. It takes that in order to minimize some of the hazards that are in our communities. It takes a dedication. It's not only just from the emergency manager, but all personnel that are involved in the emergency management office, working alongside police, fire, EMS, as well as your political stakeholders. And also, believe it or not, using your school corporations can also be a big benefit too. And how you say, well, how can a school corporation help out in a situation like this? Well, for example, if you do happen to have an overflow of patients at a hospital, schools have gymnasiums, most of them, and you're able to use those gymnasiums as an overflow or an alternative care site. And working alongside school administration, school principals, as well as those executives that are within the school corporation itself, if you have stakeholder buy-in from them, then you have an alternative operation and an alternative location that you can utilize when the chips are down and things can go awry. Also, resilient community is one that can recover from the impact of that specific hazard. It may be a couple weeks, it may be a couple months, it may take up to a year. In some instances, it may never recover. If it takes a couple weeks, it's due to the fact that planning was done, recovery efforts were made ahead of time, and things were well organized and you had stakeholder buy-in. If it takes a couple months, it can depend on the gravity of the situation or disaster. It can also depend on the amount of finances that are involved, as well as the stakeholder buy-in from both community members and the political members here. And then finally, if a community has a very difficult time or has people that have long since moved out of that community, it's a combination of probably a really traumatic incident that had taken place as far as an explosion, or if it's a hurricane, for example. a lot of members of that community may not come back because they don't want to have that risk any longer and may relocate to another location within the state or perhaps out of state. They perhaps may be living with loved ones in another location too. So keep that in mind as you're going through the resiliency and the recovery phases here for your natural and human-made disasters. And then finally, we're looking at normalcy. What is normal? I don't know anymore. I don't think too many people know what normalcy is anymore based on our global conditions and our global economic strife that we've recently encountered. But risk management and hazard mitigation activities, these help promote normalcy. Now, how you utilize those tools will depend totally on your emergency managers and the political stakeholders as well as the community stakeholders. All these need to be tied together. So there's the combination of education and working alongside one of the community efforts and being able to be resilient in times of great emergencies and disasters, and then finally getting back to that normalcy. So this way you can go on with life after a disaster or any type of emergency has taken place. Moving on to slide 4, and responder safety. A key focus of every incident response and disaster is responder safety. We all know that going to an emergency scene, there's a lot of things that are going on, especially, for example, if you're a police officer or if you're dealing with firefighting and emergency vehicles, etc. You're going at high rates of speed as well as going through stoplights and proceeding with caution, and you have side streets and you have the rain, the wind, the elements, etc. You all know if you've been in that situation before. And oftentimes, these early warning signs are definitely going to make an impact. Responder safety, if you don't get there, you're not doing anyone any good. You're not arriving there. So if you happen to get an accident or other, then you're not doing anyone any good. So a lot of these responses need to be conducted very, very cautiously. The adrenaline rush that we all have, of course, is going to be there. It's pumping our hearts faster to go through the intersections faster, etc. However, proceeding with caution is the best way. And then, the safety consideration by those completing the mission and the assignments are second nature, but safety measures can still be strengthened at the administrative levels during the planning stages. So there have to be protocols that are going to be set in place. There has to be the willingness of stakeholder buy-in from crew members or from the administration, and a combination of both that are going to be working alongside one another in an effort to promote first responder and response safety mechanisms. And this isn't something that happens overnight. Let's face it, we're all creatures of habit. We all believe in doing the same thing over and over and over again. Why? Because we've been taught that way, and it's easy, and you don't want to get out of your comfort zone. However, safety standards are here to strengthen the response, to strengthen the people that we're dealing with, to help set up incident command centers or the alternative care sites and hospitals and things. All these things that need to come together in an effort to minimize some of the life safety issues that first responders can run into. And speaking of administration, what wouldn't be a good class without leadership? Of course, we're going to go back into leadership. Yes, a good leader will be needing to run the operation, and even with the numerous personalities that are out there that are going to be conflicting, of course we've never had that. Everybody just sits around and agrees at all times, and everyone runs the same show the same way. If you believe that, yeah, then I have a nice big Mirage that I can sell you out in Nevada, out there in the desert, yes. But a good leader is going to need to be flexible. We probably covered this in the 6305 class, where the leaders need to be flexible. Yes, policy is wonderful. It's a good thing to have. But if policy fails and that flood doesn't follow Section 5, Subset A with response, you have a problem. You need to follow how the water is going to run and what's going to be going on at that time. Policy is good. Policy needs to be enforced. Mitigation practices and preparation need to be there. However, things change every 2 seconds during a disaster, and you need to be prepared for that. So being able to follow your policy is good, but also being flexible is even better. A visionary. The good leader is going to be a visionary. We have to think ahead of time. We have to think about operations, our personnel, and what may occur to the community members and the community at large regarding finances. Should we make one decision? We have to think ahead of time and being able to identify some of the circumstances surrounding the community, some of the hazardous materials, for example, or if we're in a highly prone area for tornadoes or hurricanes or flooding, whatever it may be. These are the visions that we need to be cognizant of in an effort to mitigate some of the circumstances. And then being fair with the people that are working around us. We need to offer an olive branch, if you will, to the people that, well, might not be so friendly and might not want to work alongside them, and say, hey, why don't we try this method? What are your thoughts? What are your ideas? How can we work alongside one another rather than just driving this one point home that I may have or that you may have, whatever it may be. But being fair with all personnel and having them share their thoughts and ideas promotes camaraderie as well as gets the job done and it gets it accomplished along the way. So again, remember that a good leader will have some issues that he or she may confront along the way, not only in the field, but also with multiple personalities, but being flexible, following policy, being a visionary, and also being fair with the personnel that are out there is a good combination and putting forth a good effort to identify some of the shortcomings that there are immediately, some of the shortcomings that may be down the road, and some of the benefits that will eventually arise after those shortcomings are going to be dealt with. In slide 6, now we change it back a little bit. We talked about administrative duties. We talked about leadership. We talked about responding to an emergency and being able to be safe there. Well, speaking of being safe, yeah, the use of personal protective equipment here. That's a standard communication in itself. So being able to use that equipment, especially if we're dealing with, for example, COVID-19, you need to be gloved up and gowned and masked and etc. That's one part of it. The same thing applies depending on the situation. If you're going to be dealing with a hazardous material that's out there, you're going to need the proper PPE. If it's going to be class A, B, or C, whatever it may be, you need to identify that ahead of time. Thus, that goes back to our previous slide of being a visionary if you happen to be a leader and understand that these are some of the situations and what these chemicals may be that can occur. Communications, we know that communication is the first thing that always fails, whether it's going to be in one of our exercises or if it's going to be in the real situation. That will take place first. And then we have to identify how we can fix it. Hopefully we have a backup system and respond to those actions that are taking place regarding communications or whatever it may be. So such as using a body of systems in a line of sight and mitigating the immediate incident hazards, for example. So communication, PPE, and then the response to those actions are all going to be combined in order to address the immediate hazard at hand. And then, for example, some activities that are going to go on there might be that the first responders oftentimes have ingrained in their minds and therefore do not require much thought, meaning that things are already in place, meaning that they've done this several times. It's almost like walking and chewing gum, for example. I have trouble doing that, so maybe it's not a good example, but for all practical purposes here, what we're looking at is being able to do something with commonality and with just fluidity during a disaster. The more you practice something, the easier it's going to become, whether it's going to be riding a bike, whether it's going to be being a videographer or whoever you might be out there. You do this on a daily basis, it's going to be a lot easier. So if you paint well, then you know that if you do it every day, it's going to be a lot easier than if you don't do something. And you can fall out of graces with that if you don't practice it. Thus, going back a few slides, you can see the importance of working alongside one another. Community collaboration, community communication, and then practicing in the community for tabletop exercises as well as full-scale exercises. But the use of PPE here is definitely one of the high standards for promoting risk management issues and also being able to respond to those issues that are out there in the field by promoting positive social change actions within that group, within the emergency management services by the use of PPE. And looking forward here, yes, we have PPE, we have safety and education, and we're communicating, we're collaborating. It still takes a toll on us as far as mental health is concerned, and mental health for responders. You're thinking, well, yeah, but we're out there. We have the big S on our chests because we're super people and we're able to do all these good things, and people realize that we're infallible. We can't be, conquered whatsoever, except when the adrenaline rush is over with. And except when we actually take that uniform off and then we just feel really lousy because we are mentally and physically drained. The mental health and mental stress of first responders and emergency services personnel is likely, we've gained more interest in this. And it's due to the fact because the evolution of technology and the use of social media. You know yourself that if you happen to go back and look at an incident and things, you can see the eustress, meaning positive stress, that takes place, that euphoric feeling that you're out there and you can promote and provide superhuman strength in an effort to mitigate the circumstances in the field. But on the other hand, then you're looking at afterwards the negative stress, the regular stressor that you're going to be experiencing, where you just feel like a worn out dish rag because you felt miserable because you spent up all that energy and your body was tense, etc. And it does play mentally as well. Those were some of the physical things, but the mental things, you go back and you keep reliving that incident and you keep thinking about what could have been done, and you play armchair quarterback in regards to the emergency incident. Well, I could have done this and this should have been done here, and what else could I have done better? That's why you have an after action report, but it shouldn't be continually mentally blocking you as you go about your daily and occupational life. It's just something that needs to be considered in moving along. Now, large events such as 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina have helped focus and bring that mental health aspect and considerations closer to the surface, meaning that we're delving into this a little bit more and seeing that these issues are arising within our first responders and public agencies. And both the policymakers and leadership need to understand what the process is and that these recovery agencies are there. Let's face it, prior to 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina, and now probably in dealing with this in the future with this COVID-19, we're not really looking at too many mental health issues and behavioral health personnel that are going to be part of the preparation team or part of the mitigation team as well as the recovery team. It was unheard of because we could all handle it, we could all take it, which was a fallacy back then, and it's a fallacy now. We are all human beings, regardless of whether or not we're going to be a first responder or if we're going to be someone that is just working as a volunteer that's passing out food, whatever it may be during a disaster. We all have issues and we all have triggers that are going to arise after, during, and perhaps even before a disaster has taken place, because you may be involved in multiple disasters. But something needs to be done, and the behavioral health team being on the premises to assist mental health needs for responders as well as the community definitely should be considered. So remember that mental health is just an up and coming thing. It continues to surface, it continues to gain more momentum as we move along, and also such events as 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, COVID-19, and a couple other incidents that may have taken place in the past that need to be looked at in depth and also be considered for these behavioral health personnel to be part of our emergency management team in an effort to mitigate some of the circumstances surrounding our first responders. So in looking forward, some of the proactive approaches that we can have to risk management. We covered an awful lot so far in this lecture. Well, here's a little bit more for you. So what we're looking at is being proactive and being able to identify what is going to occur in emergency planning, what we should be introducing with an interagency approach, as well as mutual aid and establishment of the provision for a mental health care plan. This doesn't come overnight. There has to be stakeholder buy-in. Again, you've heard that and you're probably saying, okay, I get it, Dr. Milan, stakeholder buy-in, community collaboration, etc. Well, it does. You do need that, and this needs to take place in order to get things moving forward. A proactive approach doesn't say, well, yeah, we need to have that, and perhaps we can include that in our documentation. It doesn't happen that way. It happens by putting the pen to the paper, or I know that probably dates me, pen and paper, but this will probably be better, putting it into a Word document while you type, or you could voice dictate that into a Word document. There you go. Now we're up to 2020-ish standards. But putting this down in writing needs to be taken care of. And a proactive approach towards mental well-being should include employee assistance programs. I know in the past that the EAPs haven't been able to quite reach the numbers that they have wanted to and achieve in the past, with many disasters and many issues, because there wasn't that support and the need for it from leadership, for example. But now leadership now promotes this more often than not, and also has an opportunity to say that, yeah, we're here for you, and we're able to identify those areas you need perhaps to mitigate in your life after an event has taken place. So being a risk manager, for example, within an organization, if it's going to be a hospital or if it's going to be someplace in emergency management program, the risk manager has his or her hands full. Try saying that 10 times real fast. But you will definitely have your hands full when it comes to mitigating these circumstances for mental health. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. It takes communication, collaboration with the mental health professionals. Behavioral health is something that's kind of taboo, especially for fire and EMS and police personnel, due to the fact that they feel that they're invulnerable, due to the fact that they feel that they can overcome many of these mental health issues that appear to arise after an incident, and they feel that they're being threatened if they have to be placed into an employee assistance program. As a former firefighter, as a former training officer with a fire department, I totally understand these concepts, and I can empathize with many of these EMS personnel that feel this way. It's important to understand that we're human. Things do occur, and it's okay to talk about things in a convenient area, in a confined area where your word is going to be with one person or another, and that's it. This way, it's a good environment to be in, and something that's going to be well respected and well received later on down the line. Now, a few areas in risk management are the following. We have the role of three primary sectors. You have the private sector, the public sector, and then the nonprofit sector. So, for example, the private sector here is going to be one that is not under government control, but owns or maintains control of almost 90% of the infrastructure and resources within the United States. That's a lot, 90%. So you're talking the private sector is going to be your private industry, your private businesses, your smaller businesses, etc. They're not going to be under governmental control, and they're going to be able to make some of the decisions that are out there. But again, being private does have its benefits, but again, it has its negatives, because if you're just in the private sector, you might not have the opportunity to work with the public sector, with the government, where funding may be needed. And if you're unwilling to, well, play nicely in the sandbox, as we always say in the emergency management world, then you're going to run into some issues and isolate yourself. The private sector is good. The private sector normally maintains bountiful resources as far as finances are concerned, as far as working alongside other companies and other organizations. But again, they have to work alongside the public sector as well as the nonprofit sector here. And in looking at the public and nonprofit sectors, the public sector is, as much as I mentioned in the previous slide, government, and it's often defined with the various levels of government under the sovereign areas here. So we know the majority of the public sectors you're looking at some of the governmental organizations that are with the police, with the fire, with the EMS. You're also looking at, for example, working with the EPA. You're also working with Homeland Security, etc. So these are what you refer to as your governmental agencies, your public agencies in general. Now you can start to see the link between public and private. they can't make it without being able to work alongside the private industry. The private industry is out there for the financial impetus and the financial strength, where the public sector normally is out there in dealing with mitigating some of the circumstances that might happen to a private entity or an organization. You need to work together and be on the same page. That's where good leadership and leadership quality of being a visionary comes into play, working interjurisdictionally as well as working alongside one another in the public and private area. And let's not forget our nonprofit sector, and that is made up of those non-governmental organizations that are formed by the communities or the groups of individuals functioning independently of the government. So, for example, if you have a hospital that it happens to be a nonprofit hospital, do they receive governmental funds? Yes. On the other hand, they're not working directly with the government. They have their own organization. They have their own sets of guidelines, as well as following some protocols from the federal government, for example. So in order to receive certain amounts of monies and funding, much like we do with grants, this needs to be done. We need to work alongside that particular entity in order to do so. It's a tiered approach. You have the private, public, and nonprofit organizations and sectors, if you will, that are working alongside one another in order to coordinate efforts to mitigate circumstances in disasters and provide emergency management services when and if they're going to be needed. Hopefully they never will, but being at the same table and working alongside one another ahead of time, thus is your pre-planning, your planning, your mitigation efforts ahead of time. These will all come into play later on down the line. So again, just a real quick recap here. You have the private sector, you have the public sector, and you have your nonprofit sector. Your private sector is normally going to be your financial institutions. Your public sector will be your governmental institutions, much as I made mention of, several of them. And then your nonprofit sector is going to be made up of those non-governmental organizations that are going to be formed by your communities. And these nonprofit organizations have these wonderful things. Actually, people, they're called volunteers. When the disaster has taken place, they come out of the woodwork and they are able to help. For example, if you have a large church that has a large community of 800 in population, shall we say, you have a good foundation to have volunteers. Not each member of the parish is going to be able to help, for example. However, if you could get at least 300 of those people out of that parish to assist, that would be a good number, and you have a good collaborative effort that is occurring from that nonprofit sector. So keep that in mind as you're trying to make your plans and working alongside your coalition members and parties, that the nonprofit sector definitely will be a benefit to you. So in getting back to the private sector has a significant interest in getting back to a sense of normalcy. And the reason why, money is time. Time is money. And that's the reason why. That's their main focus in being able to get back to work. So there may be leveraged into a true whole community focus, and they're going to assist the community as much as they can, but they also need to assist themselves because they are private. Much as we see with COVID-19 and the small business owners right now, they want to get back to work. You have people that are out there that have been for 30 and 40 years working at this particular business, and now all of a sudden there's nothing. And they're in the midst of a disaster. They want to get back to work. They want to do things. They want to provide their services to the community because that's benevolence out of their own hearts. But at the same time, they have families too, and they need to put food on the table as well. So you have to take that into consideration too when you're dealing with the private sector. Yes, it's dealing with a lot of financial stability there, but also getting back to that sense of normalcy comes from having self-worth, from self-promotion into the community, and then the community realizing that this service was missed during this disaster. So, for example, here, how public-private partnerships have been utilized. Well, the New York Police Department SHIELD program, which is a collaborative effort to share law enforcement activity and awareness information. That's how you deal with public entity, and that's how you deal with the private entity. You're working alongside one another. The public entity being the NYPD, and them willing to share their information with a private organization and coming to that organization. That's the way these things work, and in vice versa, that perhaps this private organization might have an extra amount of funding, and they might be able to buy, for example, extra training materials, whatever it may be that the particular police department may need, or in that jurisdiction, because there was a working relationship that was established there. Now they're able to do this. Now they're willing to do so. So keep that in mind if you happen to be in any one of these three sectors, which I think many of you would fall into that category. But keep in mind that it's not just one sector that's going to be impacted by an emergency or disaster. It's going to be all three sectors that are going to be impacted, and all three sectors should be willing to help one another. And then there's this little thing called resilience. Yeah, we have this community resilience and the ability of a community to rebound from a disaster or a catastrophe, and that's shown to be strength and good governance practices. So if you have a good community resilience, much like we talked about at the top of the hour, that resilience is going to be something that's going to be in strength in numbers, strength in being able to plan, prepare, mitigate, and disseminate information of circumstances that may be beyond our control, but we're able to control as much as we can during that disaster. The federal government support then is for all phases of emergency management, and that appears to be a necessary approach to ensure that all the states have a level of assuredness for public safety. Again, it starts at the local level, local preparedness, local supplies, local finances. Budgets need to be constructed, and budgets need to be followed as well. Not only there, but then when the disaster might be too big for the local area, then it goes into the state. The state budget must need to be there as well. The state has all these finances that are supposedly there, and hopefully will be able to be utilized during this emergency. And finally, then the government, federal government, is going to play an important role in being able to provide disaster and emergency response relief. Again, being prepared for 96 hours, you will need to be self-sufficient for that time until you do receive a federal response or a declaration of emergency has been established, much like we see here with COVID-19 circumstances that have taken place in the past. So keep that in your pocket there, knowing that resilience is something that is going to take a little bit of time. You can rebound from a disaster, but it will depend on your preparation and mitigation efforts, and that the federal government is going to be there for you. But planning does start at the local level, then it goes into the state level, and then finally you get federal government assistance depending on the type of disaster that you're going to be facing. And finally, wrapping everything up over here, bringing all the stakeholders together and the whole community approach becomes a force multiplier. Well, what do I mean by a force multiplier? You're shoving people into doing something that they don't want to do? No, meaning that it's safety in numbers, meaning that you're able to work alongside one another, actively seek participation, and build upon stakeholders in the community with your resources, and find out, what do we all have? What are we going to do? How can we do this? What are we going to impact? How are we going to do this? For other jurisdictions that are going to be there, what are some of the shortcomings that we have? What are some of our strengths and weaknesses that might be down the line and during the course of that disaster emergency? That's where bringing all the stakeholders together comes into play. And then actively seeking that participation for hazard mitigation activities, and then support that response for that disaster will eventually take place. It sure makes it a lot easier when you know all the players in the jurisdiction and then in other jurisdictions that are surrounding you, and making that what I refer to as a warm call, and saying, yes, this is Dave, and I'm over in this miserable situation here. We have a flood, and we need some boats, and we need some buses, etc. And if you happen to know that the local school corporation superintendent was attending your coalition, guess what? You're more likely to receive those buses and such for evacuation purposes than you would with not. And same thing goes back to nonprofit organizations working alongside Salvation Army and American Red Cross, etc. They are going to be advocates for helping you out as well, but also including them, the local area. They will also be able to assist you should the need arise, and it just doesn't come from dealing with a local emergency, but it can be something at the state level too, where you're meeting these people during state exercises. It all comes into play. So the main thing to remember here is to communicate. That's the big issue. Sometimes we fail to do so, and we feel that we can mitigate circumstances from behind our desk, and we can just figure out things on the fly, and that's not what's going to take place. Planning, preparation, mitigation, recovery efforts, resilience, mental health issues that can arise are all parts of a disaster or an emergency, and that's part of the risk management that is taking place. There's so much more involved in risk management other than the areas that we discussed in this presentation today. We'll see a little bit more of that in the upcoming weeks, but it's never complete thesaurus of information that's out there. We keep learning as we go along. But keep in mind that good leadership and being a visionary, as well as having all of the participants sitting around the table and one person being able to lead those participants and keep a good communicative team together and a good community team together is true diligence, but it's also something that will definitely be necessary later on down the line.